And welcome back to this 3-part series where I talk about every type of transmission for the Generation 1 Audi R8. And I introduce you the slowest shifting of the 3 transmissions, the gated manual. Now, this transmission is a manual 6-speed transmission with a proper 3-pedal clutch. So, therefore, you would need to roll your own gears. Of course, everyone knows that already. Let's talk about the characteristics of this transmission. Yes, let's talk about the gates. The 6 gates that you have in this transmission where you roll your own gears. One thing to note that this gate is very precise. That's the big characteristic of this gated manual. It's very precise and it is notchy. So it slides in to every single gate very purposely and with an absolute precision that is hard to describe. Again, a lot of people have said that it's like sliding a bolt action rifle. It's very, very precise, and it is. It very is. A lot of people want this type of transmission because it is a super precise and super hefty feeling when you're shifting the lever. So it tells you how precise the German engineering and also the Italian engineering had, because it's a similar mechanism in the Lamborghini Gallardo. So it tells you that there was a lot of thought put into this type of transmission to give you that hefty, solid feel when you shift into the gates. It's a really solid feel. So that's the defining characteristic of this gated manual car. What does that mean? Well, you need to shift very precisely, meaning that you can't be sloppy in that sense versus other manual cars you may have driven. So you have to slide the lever into each proper gate properly. You cannot rush these shifts. So you gotta let these synchros do the work for you. So that's one thing that you need to be aware of when you're driving this type of transmission. Of course, I will also say that the pedal is actually pretty light compared to other supercars, other sports cars of this caliber like the 911. So therefore, it is actually quite daily drivable. I think it's one of the most daily drivable clutches that you could ever use for a car of this caliber. The other transmissions, such as the R8 and the S-Tronic, the dual clutch, there's a mechanical robot that actually shifts for you and it's lightning fast. So again, if you expect to set world records with this type of transmission, I would say don't bother, because this type of transmission is meant for enjoyment in the back rows, as you can see, shifting, downshifting, and really engaging all of your senses, your tactile, your auditory, as well as your visual senses. And yes, the click-clack is a very, very defining characteristic of this gated manual, because it gives you that auditory satisfaction when you go and shift through the gates. Oh, and just lovely, lovely, lovely sounds and lovely clicks, clacks of the transmission. Now, the shifter, the gated shifter, is very weighty. The springs are actually not light. There is sort of a resistance when you're actually grabbing the shift lever and changing gears, and the lever slides into each gate very well. You get a sense of big satisfaction, because you know when you hit up against the synchro and you lock that synchro into the speed gear of your transmission. Now, one thing to note, when I first started learning how to shift in this car specifically, the shift from first gear to second gear or downshift from third to second gear is a little tricky, because if you were to pull the shift down to the lower left instead of just straight through from 1 to 2 or from 3 to 2, it could bind, because it is a very precise shifter, meaning that it will try to go into the reverse gate. So therefore, I really recommend when you get this car, when you're test driving it, be very careful of shifting from 1 to 2, because if you're pulling it down from 1 to 2 at an angle and not straight up and down like this way, you can bind and you won't be able to shift into second gear. I thought I was doing something wrong, or I thought my whole gated conversion, which I converted this car myself from an R8 to a gated manual, I did something wrong. I'm like, what is going wrong? But then I slowly figured it out. So that's a tip. That's a characteristic of this type of transmission when you're operating this. Now, the best analogy I can give you when you're operating this gated manual is to operate like if you were a conductor leading an orchestra. You have to be very precise with your movements, and you don't need to necessarily just shift fast or shift hard with this transmission. Again, let the synchros do the work for you, and then you'll have a very smooth and refined, I dare say, experience when you're operating this car. Now, as far as maintenance of this gated manual system, there's not a whole lot to maintain. Of course, you need to take care of your transmission itself and change your fluids every 3 years or 30,000 miles. However, there are certain things that you can do as a owner to help maintain your manual transmission system, such as adjusting the shifter cables. Now, the shifter cables will stretch over time in this car, and if they stretch, they can knock the entire system out of neutral, and then you'll be ending up grinding a shift fork or grinding a shift collar. So therefore, what I recommend is you go in and just adjust your shifter cables annually. Other things to note for the mechanical actuator is that since there's no heat shield on top of the mechanical actuator, the heat of the exhaust can melt a seal on top of the mechanical actuator and cause a leak. So that's another thing that you may want to look into and modify your mechanical actuator by adding a heat shield on top of it. Oh boy, it's so hard for me to try to remain as objective as possible when I'm operating this gated manual car, because me personally, it gives me such an engaging, refining experience for me personally. So it's such a joy to drive, because the car now really challenges you to drive and operate it in a precise manner. And if you happen to get it after like hours of practice with this car, it gives you a rewarding and satisfactory experience. So it's really hard for me to try to remain objective as possible. But yes, this manual car, like other manual cars, begs you to drive it precisely. And that is the whole point of driving this car with the gated manual shifter. If you're able to match the gears, downshift, rev shift at that precise level, rev matching it, it just makes a very satisfying experience for a certain type of driver. So really, if you're that driver who is begging for a lot more work, actually, really, you have to work more. You have to work at it to really reap the benefits of this experience of driving this car. The gated manual car may be the right transmission for you. So one thing of note that I forgot to mention during the drive is that whenever you upshift, say from second gear to third gear or whatever, the RPMs, the engine does not hang the RPMs, meaning that as soon as you clutch in, the RPMs immediately drop. Unlike other modern cars with a computer that helps you hang the revs to between your shifts, it doesn't do that in this car. So one thing that I've had to learn driving this car was I had to blip the throttle a little bit to help hang the revs so I could catch the RPMs at the right moment when I release the clutch to make it a smooth transition from one gear to another gear. So again, just FYI for you, it's a very precise level of driving, more like you could say old school way of driving. So that is one thing of note for you to be cognizant of when you're driving a gated manual for the first time. One thing I also need to mention is that yes, it does have hill assist, so you won't have to struggle using your e-brake or having to feather the throttle a little bit to be able to help start your car on the hills. And now I know some people don't like hill assist, whatever. I personally like it. It's there and it will help you just move the car when you're on the hill. So there we have it. That is the gated manual transmission. And yes, the defining characteristic of this car is the gated shifter. It's very weighty. The springs is very nice and tight, and it gives you a very solid feel and auditory click-clack that you may want in your driving experience. Again, it's very hard for me to remain objective when I talk about this gated shifter because it is so good. It gives you a very satisfactory auditory experience when you're shifting like this, as well as a kinetic experience because it allows you, the driver, to be very connected with your car because you're feeling the shifts, you're feeling the vibrations that's being transmitted from the transmission to the cable and to the shifter itself. Now, as far as challenges operating this car, well, the only challenge is just to learn how to operate this shifter because it requires you to be very precise in your shifting. Furthermore, the cables can stretch, causing premature wear on your shift forks and or your shift collar. So therefore, again, highly recommend you to annually just adjust your shift cables. That is one of the main things that you can do to help preserve your shift forks and shift collars. You don't have that issue if you have an R-tronic or S-tronic car, but for the gated manual car, yes, adjust your shift cables. Well, that's it. Hope you enjoyed this 3-part series of me driving and talking about each different type of transmission for the Generation 1 Audi R8. I hope this was informational for you, and I hope this will help you figure out what type of transmission you want when you're shopping for an Audi R8 Generation 1.